Okay, final thing I want to talk about here is something called the demographic transition. Okay, and so the demographic transition is this transition process that populations tend to take. Okay, so it's the demographic transition works like this. Stage one, high birth rates, high death rates. Okay, so in the past, when countries were extremely poor and didn't have access to modern medicine, this is the case around the world. And that's what we saw um, in the beginning. We saw the data was essentially in human history, the population was growing super slow. And it wasn't until the 1700s when that started to pick up a little bit, and like 1800s and then 1900s, and it started to grow very fast. Okay. So this is the stage that most people were in the not so distant past. So slow or low population growth rates. Then what happens next? Death rates start to fall, but birth rates remain high. And we're going to look at the birth rates a little bit later. Death rates start to fall. One of the things that happened was as countries start to develop, they get access, for example, some basic health, access to cleaner water, people have better nutrition. What's really happened in the 1900s is then we got things like vaccines, we got antibiotics and other kinds of basic medicine that started to spread around the world, and it made the probability of dying much, much, much less. Okay, and at first it tends to be that birth rates remain high, and then they eventually start to fall. So we're going to talk about that in a next section. We talk about the micro of birth rates. So, but they tend to remain high. They partly remain high because the fertility rate remains high, and they also partly remain high because of this inertia situation. But this leads to rapid population growth. So the population is growing fast because the death rates have fallen, but birth rates are still high, and the population starts to grow really fast. And then eventually the birth rates start to fall as well, and the population growth rate slows down. So the birth rate falling as well. Remember, birth rate is not per family. Birth rate is for the whole society. It's like an average. So it starts to fall initially because people start to have less children. And then it continues to fall even more as the society starts to age. And eventually it falls enough that the population growth rate not only slows down, eventually it seems to fall enough, and we could call this maybe stage 4 or stage 5, where the population basically stops growing. And even in some cases now is actually starting to shrink. Okay, so this is a picture of the demographic transition of Western Europe. So in stage 1, the birth rate and the death rate are both pretty high, but population is growing. This is the growth, but it's not growing very fast. And then the first thing that happens is this death rate falls quickly, but the birth rate doesn't change that much, and so our growth rate gets much bigger. Okay, our growth rate gets much bigger, but then eventually the birth rate falls too, and our growth rate gets smaller, right? Back to where it started. And then eventually, this is what's happening now. What happened now is this. So if we go to the future to now, this is as population, sorry, I went too far there. As the population gets older and the fertility rates get super low, then the birth rate goes below the death rate and the population starts to shrink. So this has been happening recently in several countries in Europe over the last few years, and it's also happening in Japan as well. Okay, so this is the idea of what the so-called demographic transition. So you go through this period of slow population growth, and you get to fast population growth, and then eventually it slows back down again. And we're going to find out later on that actually the development process kind of helps it to do the slowdown. Okay, so what's going on in developing countries? What has gone on in developing countries compared to what happened in Europe? So the first thing about developing countries, the fall in death rate was more rapid than the European countries. And one of the big reasons is because of technology transfer in healthcare and medicine. So things like vaccines and antibiotics and related kind of health advances were able to be transferred to developing countries pretty easily because they're fairly easy to administer. And those cause huge, really rapid falls in the death rates. Okay, so there they impart technology and medical knowledge, whereas versus in Europe, there was this kind of slow improvement as they slowly discovered ideas, whereas developing countries were able to just make a leap because they were able to use ideas that had already been developed. The other thing is the developing countries at the time when they started this transition, their birth rates were higher than the European countries were at the time they started the transition. So European countries, most of their birth rates were around 4 or 5 at the start of the transition, whereas the most of the countries that are still classified as developing countries, their birth rates were in the 7s at the start of this transition. One of this is possibly, there's lots of discussion about this, but one of them is there was a European social norm because of the way that marriage customs worked, that it tended to push towards later marriage than happened in some other countries, and this would have been part of the reason the birth rate was just happened to be lower there. But the birth rates have also dropped much faster in developing countries than they did in Europe. So in Europe, it took 200 years for this to happen, and in 150 to 200 years for this to happen, and in developing countries, this has been happening over a much shorter period of time, as both parts have happened much faster. Okay, I just included this chart. I'm not going to talk so much about it, but I included this chart so you can take a look at it. You might want to pause it. Or you can just go look at the PPT slide, but it kind of shows this, and then it adds on the 4 and the 5 that I mentioned earlier. So it adds these stages. So basically, yeah, you have this time when death rate's high, birth rate's high, you're not growing, and then death rate falls a lot, you grow fast, and then eventually the birth rate falls, and then you stop growing. Okay, so that's basically what's going on. And it kind of summarizes the different reasons at the bottom. So I thought that would be useful to you. Again, I'm not going to go through it because I've mentioned almost all of these things. I just thought it would be useful to you. Only thing I do want to mention is these countries have pretty much all moved. So, for example, Japan is now over here. Brazil is moving towards this group. And this group of countries, especially India, has moved over here. Okay, so these countries are not as growing as fast as they were at the time this chart was made. So the data in this chart is slightly outdated. There's some movement to the right-hand side going on in all these countries. That's a little bit inaccurate. But other than that, the information at the bottom is very accurate, and you can kind of take a look at it, and it can be supplemental to what else we're doing. Okay, just to give you some ideas about countries. So like I said, this happened faster in developing countries. So look at England and Wales. We're talking, actually I underestimated 250 years, well, to the transition, we're talking about 200 years, okay? And same thing in Sweden, we're talking over 200 years. And then in Chile and India, this is happening over a faster time period. In fact, it might be even happening a little faster than these estimates were, right? So it's a little bit more compressed, the time period that this is happening over. And that's partly, again, because both of the trends are happening faster than they did before. You can see, for example, once it starts happening here, India's fall in the birth rate is quite rapid, and it's happening pretty suddenly when you compare with the ones above, especially if you look at the time period. So anyways, so we